Hello and welcome to the April 2023 podcast from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name's George Miller, and my guest in this episode is Gabrielle Chou, Associate Professor of Practice in Interactive Media Business at NYU Shanghai, China's first Sino-US research university. Before we begin, just a quick reminder that all previous episodes of this podcast are on the website at mondediplo.com, and you can subscribe to it wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss another episode. Gabrielle's been based in Shanghai for most of the past 25 years, a good vantage point from which to observe AI's growing role in everyday life in China. She writes about the country's ambition in artificial intelligence in this month's edition of the paper, in a piece entitled China's Race to Become Global AI Superpower. In this interview, we talked about some of the challenges to fulfilling that ambition. But I started with a much more down-to-earth question. How has AI already permeated daily life in China? What might strike a visitor from the West?
I think any visitor in China would be wondering right away when he arrives or she arrives in the city, in any city in China, why there are so many cameras everywhere. So those cameras, of course, exist in the West as well. But in China, they are omnipresent. They are in the streets, like in the West, but they are also at the entrance of your building, of the parking, everywhere, in the shops, obviously. And this is an area where Chinese are extremely good in AI, where they bring together the computer vision that reads images and your profile, and it can be your face, but it can be also the way you move, and identify that and collect this information to make sure that the city is secure. So that's a first thing where people would be impressed. Another thing that is a bit more amusing is where people will notice, for example, in the hotels or any department store, any larger organization, in banks, for example, you always have a little robot that comes and greets you and asks you, what do you want? And tries to help you or deliver you food in the hotel. So this is the type of AI that is present every day.
And you mentioned in your article, I guess you'd call it a smart city, which is, or partly smart city, which is controlling the traffic. Is it Hangzhou, where the whole traffic system is being controlled using AI, and therefore it's able to be much more responsive than perhaps our traditional systems where everything is just timed and is not so is not taking in live data and adjusting the system to match.
Yes, and so that goes back to those cameras that are not only looking at people, but also at the traffic. It's the same system, and it enables to, in Hangzhou, but also in other cities, to constantly monitor the traffic and adapt the traffic light so that it's a smoother ride.
It sounds like that has made a real difference to congestion in the city. It used to be, I think, the fifth most congested city in the world, and it's dropped down into somewhere in the 30s. So it's made a real impact on people's lives, I guess.
Yeah, it does. I mean, we see it every day in every city. I live in Shanghai, and the traffic is not as bad as it used to be.
And does that mean that people by and large are accepting of AI? They're welcoming to AI? Is it possible to get a sense of, people's sort of feelings about it if the robot is delivering your meal or something, but at the same time you've got cameras watching you all the time?
I would say, and this is maybe my own impression, that in general, Chinese local people are super happy with this system that has enabled security, a better city, a better environment, better service. So by and large, they seem to be very positive. They embrace it very quickly as well. And I think that's one of the characteristics of Chinese, is that when something is new, they look at it with fresh eyes and not necessarily have a very critical system to approach it. And if it does some benefit to their everyday life, they tend to accept it very quickly. Of course, with COVID, there has been a little bit of, thought into this analysis.
Because that's a situation where you might think AI could really be effective in, for example, in lockdowns, being more sensitive than a blanket lockdown. But it sounds like AI didn't really have a very significant contribution during COVID in China.
It has a contribution for the security, and that's why I say a lot of Chinese citizens may have a different approach now about this enormous system of cameras that exist everywhere, where they probably feel that it has restricted their freedom, or at least their ability to move around freely during COVID. So, they may have a different approach now to all those cameras. And, there has been also some questioning about what the camera were really watching. So the Chinese citizen may have a different view on this. Now, as AI played a very big role for research, for vaccine development, well, apparently not. And as you know, in the West, the newer vaccine were able to use AI and generative AI in particular to create something that could be modified very quickly as the virus evolved, but not in China. That's just a fact. We don't know the reason why it hasn't happened.
That's a kind of visible, on the streets, everyday life sort of side of AI in China. The other side, obviously, is the cutting edge research side. And if you sort of measure that by research papers, you quote in the article Nikkei Asia saying that in terms of quality and quantity, China is already the world leader in research papers. Can you say something about the sort of emphasis of that research and the state of that research as far as you're sort of aware of it?
So Chinese are invited to produce research paper in university more than in the West. And they have certainly a very vast pool of researcher. Naturally speaking, a lot of Chinese have studied statistics, computer science, machine learning, and have been producing a lot of articles and research on large language models and different area of AI. And they've been very good. They've been very good because the research also was funded by university, but also by large companies that had an interest. And for example, SenseTime, it's a Hong Kong company to start with, started by the University of Hong Kong and became a company. So it's research-based, university-based research that has produced this type of company that now is on the restricted list of the US, but also one on the forefront of AI in China.
And China is producing a lot of AI engineers. Every year, hundreds of thousands are being educated and turned loose. But they're not all staying in China. How big a problem is that for the Chinese AI development program?
Well, first, the reason there are so many is because, well, China is vast. There are many universities and very well funded for all the computer science departments. Most of them do their undergrad in China. And it's quite popular in China, or it was, to do a master program in a Western university. And of course, once they become available on the Western market, since there was so much demand, they got recruited by Western companies. So it's not all of them. At one point, China was extremely exciting for them to return to in those fields. And that's pre-COVID. There was an era of economic boom and a tech boom in China, and they all wanted to come back after they gained some experience in the Western world. It may be less attractive today. There is less money available. The current political environment make them maybe more worried about coming back.
So the Chinese state has said, wants to lead the world in AI development by 2030, which is clearly an ambitious aim, but they are putting resources into it. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the role the state is actually playing in helping to direct it, to shape it, to set priorities, and to control its development and its application. What sort of place does it have in the whole scheme of things?
Yeah. So first of all, let's remember that China is one of the only countries that sets plan on a yearly basis, but also on a 5 years basis, as well as I think it's 20 or 30 years basis. And they really try to build something that has legs. It's not intention, it comes with actions. So in that case, what China is proposing, there was a big fund that was enormous in size. We're talking about hundreds of millions of foreign currency, whether it's euro or dollars, and they were investing in either a startup or companies that were working in AI, and as well as the local governments also created some funds that they wanted to invest in those startup research lab in the universities, companies, semiconductor companies. All this environment was highly invested until one point where at the end of last year, we saw a shift in what was happening, and probably too much investment, not necessarily with what we call clever money, with the knowledge of knowing where to invest. So a lot of promises that were not fulfilled by those recipients of investment made the whole situation a bit less productive than one would have hoped in China, and as well as corruption. So there was a shift towards the end of that last year.
What about the setting of priorities? At what level does that happen? Or is it a matter of lots of researchers working in different fields and seeing which develop and have potential? How does the state see its role when it comes to deciding what is actually, because AI, of course, is a vast field, lots of subfields. So what about within that, setting priorities?
In China, you have competitive project within one company. It's a very traditional way of working. So you have the board making the decision and giving general aims, and then saying to their team, what would you propose? And different teams come up with different projects that may or may not receive investment, but generally they do. And the state in China has done exactly the same way. So giving the objectives, there was one on semiconductors, there were some on machine learning, there were some on health, on education. So those objectives are relatively general and let's say intentions. And then different entities will compete and see which one is the best ultimately.
And that kind of competitive environment makes me think about what's happening in the West since ChatGPT was released. And there's a great deal of trying to catch up or not to be seen to have fallen behind. And I wondered that has really energized the debate in the West about regulation, about the future, about the role that AI is going to play in our lives, and even the sort of apocalyptic vision of AI, leading to the destruction of civilization. And that's all really very recent in the West. Really, before ChatGPT, it wasn't. It was maybe being discussed by people on the inside, but it hadn't really penetrated the general cultural conversation. That's changed. I wondered if there was a debate in China about the future role of AI, in civil society, among intellectuals, among researchers, and if so, what kind of tone it had, what kind of things people were talking about in relation to AI in China.
Like in the West, and even probably more than in the West, and I'll tell you why in a second, ChatGPT really was a wake-up call. So, like in the West, it's a wake-up call because it's extremely democratic, this access to AI we've never seen before. You and I probably, on our everyday life, never interacted with AI knowingly. We did when we were taking a photo on our phone. We didn't realize that somehow it used some algorithm that are, built based on AI. But it was not something we realized. And this big realization moment happened in China exactly like in the West. And there are some discussions about what is the future of education, the potential in medicine. So there is a kind of worry and hope, exactly like in the West. So that's not very different. Where it is also a wake-up call for China is ChatGPT is American and not Chinese. And, the first attempt to produce something similar to ChatGPT were not as good, unfortunately. And I say unfortunately, not because I'm pro-China, but because I think it's important that we have different model existing everywhere in the world. So not only ChatGPT and not only Ernie by Baidu, we would all benefit from having different models that we could use, so it doesn't become a bipolar system. In China, the first attempt of competitive platform to ChatGPT were not very successful. And that was a wake-up call for China to say, well, if we want to compete with the US and maintain the firewall, we need to come up with something good. And I think they are on their way. We see already some progresses on what is coming up. And there's going to be many of the like of ChatGPT in China. The one that will emerge to be used by the public is not yet clear, but there will be something. So I think to answer in summary to your question, the wake-up call happened and is doubled by the worry that China needs to be able to compete with the Western world in generative AI. And for that, there's a need to have good talent, clever money in the right place, and the shift maybe in semiconductor investments and in large language model investment that has happened since August, let's say, of last year. So those are the area where definitely China is trying to become a superpower as well.
I imagine there must be worries within the Communist Party about the nature of generative AI, because, you mentioned firewall. With websites, it's comparatively easy to block access. With something which is by its nature generative, it's drawing from sources which may seem innocuous, but it's then generating new content. That surely must give some people in the Communist Party at least concerns about what is being unleashed. I mean, we're seeing that in the West, worrying about disinformation being created by generative AI, about the reliability of information being in question. So I imagine there are similar worries within China about what actually will be let out into the ecosystem by generative AI.
So I'm not privy to what's
Of
happening in
course, yes,
the
of
Communist
course.
Party,
No, I
but
was sort of
it's
speculating.
not
Yes, yes, yes.
it's not really open to a foreigner. The reality is, I think in China, like everywhere else, we could say the same about any authority in the West should be worried about what's going on with generative AI. Again, in China, there's a double worry about controlling power as well as what it does to society. So, the second part, I think, is common to every authority in the West as well as in China. In China, are there people that understand that it potentially could challenge the authority? I'm not sure there is this understanding. Every authority, whether it's in West or in China, my understanding is that they are extremely focused on what potentially can affect the life of citizens within the everyday, the next days, the next year, and it's more challenging to take decision on a longer basis. China has been trying to do this with this 5-year plan, 30 years plan, but with generative AI, it's a new beast. It's a new industrial slash publishing revolution. And I put the slash because for me it's a multiple revolution that is happening, and it's a monster that is a bit difficult to tackle. And I use monster quote unquote. It's new. Every day brings its tsunami of new possibilities. It must be challenging to be the Communist Party today.
An understatement. Gabrielle, we've talked about big political questions. I wanted to end on a very, very small practical, on the microprocessor, the very practical end of AI development. And I wanted to ask you, because China is under a trade embargo from the United States, it's finding it difficult to get access to the high-end microprocessors, which are obviously part of a developing AI program. When will that become a real problem? Because we've been talking about this race, the US and China vying for supremacy in AI. Is it already having an impact? And is that going to really change things if it goes on?
You say, I'm going to finish on a very small area. It's not such a small area.
I meant a small item for me. It's a big area, but it's a small thing. Yes.
Yeah, it's a small thing that the US government is hoping that will make a huge impact on China. This restriction is definitely having an impact today in China. A little bit more can be found in the article I wrote. But there is two kinds of semiconductor: the one that China is able to produce today, and the one that China does not have and needs to import. And those semiconductors are extremely necessary, for example, for the driving without a driver, for various things there, for the smart city, etc. So those very fast semiconductors for military, of course, they are necessary. Those semiconductors are forbidden to be imported in China, and they have an effect on the Chinese development, because now anyone who wants to do, for example, generative AI that we were talking about a second ago, will have to find a way to get access to those semiconductors, because in generative AI you need, and machine learning in general, you need very fast and very proficient semiconductors. Then what do? They either, China already has some, there is some stock, so that's what they can count on. or they rent servers abroad that have those semiconductors, and that's a way to leapfrog. Or they import them through various schemes, through third-party countries, and etc. And at the end, those semiconductors are available. So at the end, the restrictions are there. They are a challenge, but they don't stop artificial intelligence to progress in China. What it may do eventually is, for the smaller companies, they will have more challenges to access those semiconductors, which is not necessarily what the US wanted in the first place, but that's going to be the effect. Because to really hope that the Chinese military will not have access to it, I think it's more for the show.
I was speaking to Gabrielle Chou about her article in this month's edition of Le Monde Diplomatique, China's Race to Become Global AI Superpower. You can read her article at mondediplo.com. If you're a subscriber, you can also read every edition of the paper, going back 25 years, and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of open access content online to entice you to become one. In the words of John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world, behind the misinformation. I'll be back again next month with another interview with one of our contributors. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.